This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day, and that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
I think I just won my taxes.
Yeah?
I just switched to H&R Block in about 1 minute. All I had to do was drag and drop last year's return into H&R Block, and bam, my information is automatically there.
So I don't have to go digging around for all my old papers to switch?
Nope.
Sounds like we just leveled up our tax game.
Switching to H&R Block is easy. Just drag and drop your last return. It's better with Block.
Thanks everyone for joining me for another bonus episode of DNA Surprises. Today I am joined by Iliamari Vasquez Houston. She is a trauma therapist in Arizona, and she specializes in maternal mental health, anxiety, stress, family issues, and BIPOC first responder families. Iliamari is a mom of 2 kids, a fire wife, a grieving daughter of a father who was her biggest support, and a Latin trauma therapist whose fire has not died down to help her community. She is familiar with the cultural expectations that are held for her, but she is working on breaking those traditions. We were so excited to welcome Iliamari to facilitate a session on generational trauma at the retreat because she has a deep understanding of this. During our time together, she's going to help us understand the impact of generational cycles and trauma and becoming a cycle breaker while trying to get rid of some of the guilt that comes along with that. We'll also learn how to transform generational trauma into generational healing. I love that. While finding or improving our support systems. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. I'm excited.
Can you share a little bit with us about how you got to this point in your life and why you chose to become a therapist, supporting people through some of these challenges like generational trauma?
Gosh, that has been a long journey. I think I'm still on it. As a teenager, I moved to Arizona when I was about 7, and during my teenage years, I didn't really have a lot of support. My parents were going through separation, divorce, eventually divorced, and I didn't have anyone, who looked like me and spoke like me and had a lot of expectations culturally like me. So I kind of got lost, did some, teenage things that I probably shouldn't have done. But that led me to my social work career. I went to school, I got my bachelor's in psychology, and I started working in community mental health. I wanted to be that support for kiddos who had gone through things like me or were currently going through things like me that I did. So I worked as a case manager, as a team lead. I worked on training other case managers to work with kiddos in the community. And then that led me to supervisory, to quality improvement, and other roles in this field. I always told myself I was never going to be a therapist. I was going to do more of the administrative thing. But after being in the field, I decided I wanted to get my master's in social work because that also allowed some opportunity to do more than counseling if I ever wanted to. Then COVID happened a few years after I graduated, and that really made me look at my life, my career. I only had a son at that time, but it was really hard. My husband is a firefighter for a big city, and he was out saving the world, and I was at home trying to keep me and my son alive, so to speak. And talking to other fire families, there's not a lot of support. There was, the peer support that you could get from your close friends, people that became family, but there was not a lot of professional support. So I think it was 2021, I decided, well, if there's no support, I'm going to go be that support. And I didn't know how that was going to happen, but I was like, okay, we're just going to open up practice and see how it goes, and the clients will come. And they did, but it looked a little bit different than what I thought. But then I realized I was on the right journey. I started taking trainings, doing CEUs, and I really wanted to shift just from more of the general mental health to very specific intergenerational trauma, generational healing, BIPOC communities, and then also being at that point a mom of two, I wanted to work with moms. Anyone actually who was a caregiver who had more of that mother role, that's who I wanted to focus on in addition to the BIPOC first responder families. It was very eye-opening and humbling because here I'm hearing all these stories of people going through generational cycles and traditions and expectations. And I'm a fixer. I want to fix the world. And there were times that I couldn't fix it because there's things that are going to take time. And I know that sounds cliche, but it's just going to take more than maybe one generation to fully heal from, if we can even fully heal from it. So I've been doing a really deep dive into it, taking as many trainings, consulting with a lot of other BIPOC therapists, especially Latin therapists, just getting as much knowledge, support as I can, and then giving that back to my clients. I'm in year 3 of my private practice and I've never looked back. I love what I'm doing. I'm excited working with people, again, who look like me, who speak like me, who have those expectations and can understand some of the challenges that we are currently experiencing and then probably our next future generations will experience to some degree.
I love that kind of stepping into a space that you identified a need for, that you were looking for yourself, and then becoming that. That's really powerful. And I think ties a lot into the whole generational trauma, generational cycles piece. And I think that term generational trauma is really making its way into the cultural lexicon. Like, we're hearing it a lot more. Mm-hmm. But for people who don't know, or who've maybe kind of only sort of heard of it, how do you define generational trauma?
Generational trauma is anything that you are experiencing or have experienced and other generations can relate. That's where the intergenerational will come in. So if we think of what we're experiencing versus what our parents, caregivers experience versus what their parents, caregivers experience, and so on, that gets passed down our lineage to some extent. So anything that is community related, poverty, unsheltered people, war, those kind of traumatic events. And again, trauma is defined differently by each individual, but when it's relatable in that aspect, that's where the generational trauma, generational cycle will come in.
Okay. So how might that apply to the DNA Surprise community? Because I hear a lot of it when I talk to guests. They talk about, wanting to break generational trauma and those kinds of things. So how might it apply to this group?
There's a new concept, epigenetics. Anything gets passed down from DNA, right? Maternal grandmother, maternal mother, maternal child, and so on and so on. So there's a component of DNA that will get passed down. And there's also things that we cannot control that get passed down. So that example of war, of maybe unshelteredness, homelessness, if it gets passed down through generation, that could be a component to someone experiencing a DNA surprise where they may have wondered what was going on, but then after hearing, that surprise, they're like, oh, this kind of makes way more sense. There was something there that I didn't know. And now it gives a little bit more explanation. So the epigenetics is the study, the research, the discussion of there's a lot of stuff that gets passed down biologically to our current generation that we couldn't control, we may control, and it's that makeup within us that we're experiencing right now.
That's really interesting. I'm curious about it maybe on both sides. So for example, for myself, I definitely have some of that on my mom's side. But with my ethnicity shift, finding out that I'm not of Hispanic descent, Latin descent, and then finding out that I'm of African American descent. And obviously there's a lot of generational trauma associated with that. Mm-hmm. Is that something that we can experience from maybe our paternal sides as well?
We're made up of both sides, right? It's two people coming together and creating a biological child. Genetically, there's both of those components. So while, yes, there's more of the prominent of like grandmother, mother, woman, there's still the other person that made up that child. So we're passing down things from each side, whether we fully realize it or not.
Mm-hmm. And how maybe does like the cycles of secret keeping and shame and those kinds of things, how does that play into generational trauma?
So there, especially BIPOC community, we don't talk about a lot of things, right? I don't want to say superficial, but it's very surface level, more of that superficial, like, oh yeah, we have a job, we have a house, we have children, but we don't talk about the challenges that maybe we experience getting to that, and we hide it. We are very secretive. There's a lot of things that are taboo that we shouldn't even speak of or shouldn't even think of because it's not great. It's not healthy. So that gets passed down through caregivers, through parents, because while your parent might never say we shouldn't talk about this, you're also seeing that play out in the things that they do bring out and the things that they don't bring up. Mental health is a very big no. It's a very big thing that we don't talk about. It's like, you're sad? Well, you shouldn't be sad. Why are you sad? Oh, just put it away. We don't get sad. We don't do that over here. Same with anger, same with disappointment, same with jealousy, right? Like, oh no, we don't talk about that. We're good. We're happy. We have a house, we have food, we have clothes. That's all you need to worry about. So it's that constant cycle of maybe not even intentionally shaming the children into not bringing up, but it does happen. If we don't see something, if we don't hear it, then that's the expectation, whether it's actually said out loud or not. So if our parents are shaming intentionally or not, that gets passed down into then how the children grow up, what they're being exposed to, what is being modeled to them. Then they grow up and say, oh no, mental health is not a thing. That's made up. No, we don't do that here. We're happy. We have a house, we have food, and we have clothes. There's a lot of realization that that's been happening throughout generations. And now our current line of humans and people are like, no, we shouldn't be hiding things. We shouldn't be shaming into how we're feeling. We're complex humans. We're complex people. We have more than just one happy emotion. We have the sadness, the anger, the disappointment. And there's that conflict now of, well, why are you talking about being sad? Well, because it's okay. Oh, okay. So it's like, it's that back and forth of, like, yes, we didn't talk about that. Why should you? But then the realization, oh, okay, maybe we should talk about that a little bit because it is impacting us.
Yeah. So speaking of that, how does generational trauma impact us?
There's a lot of physical manifestations that with my trauma work, I am also trained in EMDR, and there's a lot of ways that we can ideally listen to our body that is telling us, hey, we're experiencing a traumatic event. So there's a physical component of it, and then also the internal struggle of, man, that wasn't a good experience. I feel like that was a traumatic experience. I'm getting headaches, or I'm not sleeping. I'm getting anxiety all the time. Like my chest feels super tight. My heart is beating out of control. So we're experiencing those things. And then if we're not talking about it, that gets potentially passed down. So that's where the cycle continues if we're not aware of it, if we try to avoid it, if we try to shame ourselves into, I'm fine, I'm just nervous, right? Well, it's more than that. Your body is literally telling you something is going on, and it's about trying to pay attention internally to what your body is saying.
Yeah, I think that that's something that a lot of people within this community can relate to, is those bodily sensations. What about the mental components?
The way we speak to ourselves is typically voices that we have heard, whether it's from caregivers or relatives. And that is also an internal struggle. Any intrusive thoughts, any negative thoughts of examples like feeling unworthy, feeling unloved, feeling not deserving, things that we've experienced in our life will add to those statements. As an example, if there's a parent that shows you love by giving a house, food, and clothes, but they don't say it, we might internalize it and not feel worthy, not feel loved. So that's the traumatic experiences that someone has gone through, and then add the statements of, well, they didn't say they loved me. I'm not lovable. I don't feel loved. And then that's that struggle with our thoughts of, well, if I'm not worthy, if I'm not lovable, I don't deserve, XYZ thing to happen to me. I'm okay with status quo. I don't have to share how I'm feeling because no one cares. No one wants to listen to me. No one wants to show me love.
That's so interesting about the inner voice and where that comes from. And that's really resonating. I have some things to think about. But it's true. Like, where does that monologue come from? Where does that critic come from? The whole goal with the retreat is to focus on integrating these traumatic experiences that have happened to us. And, I think the generational piece is huge because it goes back so far, and many times, especially the cycle of not talking about things and keeping secrets. And that's kind of something that I think a lot of people in our community want to stop as they look at future generations. But what are some of the things that we can do to heal from these cycles and experiences?
I would say the first thing, which I recognize is probably the hardest thing, is to recognize what's going on, validate your own experiences and your own emotions. Sometimes feelings lie. Yes, I get that. However, you're the only one that can define the traumatic event. No one can define it for you. And that looks different for each individual. That would be the first step in trying to end or stop those generational cycles, because maybe a lot of people have validated that, but they didn't do anything with it. So if we validate, acknowledge it, then we can move forward and recognize, okay, well, that's an unhealthy pattern. How can I change that? If they work with a therapist or a counselor or someone who has that therapeutic relationship with them, then we can figure out how to stop and end those cycles. But validation is key. If we don't validate it, then we're kind of hiding it. We're kind of, putting it away and keeping it a secret from even ourselves. We can acknowledge, what's happened. Saying it out loud is the hardest piece, though. After that, like I mentioned, working with a therapist or a counselor to figure out how to end those patterns. Do we need to speak up for ourselves a little bit more and say, hey, that's not necessarily something that I want to continue with you. Can we have a healthier relationship? Can we speak in healthier ways to each other? Can we just acknowledge that we have different opinions as well? Do we need to set boundaries? Do I need to not call you every day or not see you once a month? Just different avenues to change that pattern that's been going on for so long. That's how we start to stop some of the unhealthiness that we've experienced. And then the even harder piece, I think, also is we might not be the only person that stops it. It might take those future generations to stop it. We might be the first cycle breaker. We're working on breaking that cycle, that pattern, but also how we show up with our future generations, that definitely can help end those unhealthy cycles.
You beat me to my next question. And I was called out on a previous conversation with our facilitator, Vanessa, when I said, how do we fix it? How do we fix it? And she was like, I'm going to challenge you not to use the word fix. And I appreciated it because it's so true. Like, there's this tendency, myself, I instantly just want to make people feel better and kind of work through it, and not from a toxic positivity standpoint, but it's just like, tell me what are the steps? What do I need to do to go ahead and start working on this? So is it possible to break down a generational cycle in one generation? Because I would love for my kids to not deal with some of the stuff that I do.
Flex your business with an American Express Business Gold Card. You'll earn 4 times membership rewards points on your top 2 eligible spending categories, like transit and electronics, each month, on up to $150K in combined purchases per year. Plus, you can now earn 3 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Terms and points cap apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold, built for business by American Express.
So good, so good, so good.
New markdowns up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Fresh kicks, spring tops, new dresses. There's always a score.
I mean, the denim section is unreal.
Why do I rack? All the dresses. I always find something amazing.
Head to your Nordstrom Rack store to find can't-miss deals on all the spring things. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
I wish I could say yes. It's possible. It's not impossible. It just takes a lot of readjusting how we think, how we show up, how we say things, how we interact with people. It's not impossible. It's very hard because, again, we've had so many years of those patterns. And Vanessa was right. We can't fix it, but we can improve it. We can make those adjustments, make those changes to show up in a healthier way in our current generation. So then our kids will show up in a different and healthier version of us. This sounds funny coming from a therapist, but we also mess up our kids to some extent. They're going to be messed up to some extent. And I don't say that in a bad way, like, oh my God, we're bad parents. No, that's the reality of it. How we're parenting is very different. How our parents or caregivers did it, how different them, right? So there's always going to be something that we don't do 100% perfect. And if we think we're going to do it perfect, we're lying to ourselves. As long as it's a healthier version, then that's what we want to strive for. It's that progress over perfection. But our kids are going to have some component of something because they also came from us. And things were passed down, but we're trying to change that and make the adjustment so then they can show up healthier versions with their future generations if they want to. And speaking to something that, kiddos might not be biologically of someone. However, how we grew up, we impact our future, whether it was that DNA component or not as well. Because if that's our comfort level, and if we don't want to change it, that's how we're going to show up with our kids, no matter if they're biological or not, because that's what our parents did for us and it worked. And that's what we're going to do with our kids, and it's working, even though it might not be working, but that's how we show up, right? What we know is comfortable to us to some extent. And if it's not comfortable, that's where we change the patterns.
It's interesting, this point about whether or not we're biologically related to someone, we're still impacted by the generational cycles, if we were raised in that environment. And so people in the DNA surprise community, you do have the biological component where you may or may not have known these things that were impacting you for so many years, for your whole life, until you uncovered the truth that one or more of your parents is not biologically related to you, but you're still carrying this DNA element and the generational trauma and cycles that you inherit, biologically. And then you also have to contend with the nurture aspect, so to speak, of your raised parents, whether that's, you were adopted by both parents or one, or maybe nobody knew, or, whatever the situation is, you're impacted by both. So how do we handle kind of those two sides? And is the approach the same when you are dealing with, I guess, biological generational trauma versus a raised experience?
General, baseline, it can be. We want to break and stop a cycle, right? We want to break and stop a pattern that is no longer working, hasn't really worked, is no longer serving us. So yes, as far as the approach, yes, we want to stop it. Now, how we stop it varies individually, whether it's biological or not. What works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. What works for you doesn't necessarily work for another person, right? So we want to make sure that it's really individualized and it works within the culture as well. And when I say that is in Latin cultures, we don't break up with our parent per se. They're still going to be around to some extent. That doesn't give them full access to you. However, we're very familial as far as like, yes, that's our parent. They might not have been the best, but I can't turn my back on my mom, right? There's a lot of that mentality. So we have to also be very aware of that when therapists and counselors are suggesting certain treatment modalities, certain recommendations, because if you tell a Latin woman to break up with her mom, she's going to be like, no. And this is our last session. Thank you very much. Right. Unless that's what she wants. But generally that might not happen. Right. It's how to work within that culture and what you're suggesting. That's where the individual piece will come in. Maybe she just talks to her mom a couple times a year, and that's what she is okay with to some extent, even though she might feel sad or disappointed, that guilt, that shame, because our parent is no longer who we thought or wanted them to be, but it works for her. If that works for her, then that might not work for somebody else. Again, that's that individual piece. So it's, yes, breaking a cycle, that's the general, rule of thumb for the cycle breakers, but how we go about it can be very different.
That's such a good point, that what works for some isn't going to work for all, and you really have to find what works for you. And especially within the different cultural expectations, every culture is very different in terms of how they relate to their parents, and that's something definitely to consider. We're big on resources around here, and I know you mentioned before we started recording that you had a book that you wanted to recommend to people. So I'm curious about any resources that you might want to point people to if they want to learn more about generational trauma and cycles and cycle breaking.
Yes, absolutely. The first book that I would highly recommend, Dr. Marielle, Break the Cycle. It's a guide to healing and intergenerational trauma. Amazing work. She's done a lot of research on intergenerational trauma. I have the book personally and recommend it for clients, and I feel like it's a game changer. Some people might not be ready to dive deep into this kind of work. So maybe it's finding books that validate an experience, but don't do like that super deep dive. I also recommend another book, Self-Care for Latinas. Obviously, it's for a specific culture, but it can also translate to other BIPOC communities. It's shifting the way that we care for ourselves versus the recipe of take a bubble bath, take a walk. Yes, we can have components of that. However, it's also very specific to our cultures too. So that book is just a different way, a different lens to looking at caring for ourselves. But the Break the Cycle book by Dr. Marielle, I highly recommend that book. There's also a lot of, social media information regarding generational trauma and cycles. I would suggest looking through that too, but also recognizing that it's one person telling their story too. If it's backed by research, okay, great. That's more appropriate. But if it's more of like, oh, this is, my story and it doesn't fit you, then okay, find something else that could work for you. You made that comment about generational trauma and generational healing. We really are trying to heal. We're trying to heal and start the healing towards future generations. And it's a very big deal. It's a really great awakening is what I call it.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, it is an awakening. We are really trying to break these cycles of secrets and shame. And I know we'll dive much deeper into this at the retreat, but for people who are interested in attending, can you kind of give us a little more detail on what your session will be about and some of the things we'll cover?
I will definitely be sharing more of the epigenetics information, the DNA component, the biological component, and then also how culturally, whether biologically or not, how we show up, as a community, as a generation. just because it's a really important aspect. Like we've been talking about, one size doesn't fit all, right? It has to be very individual. And at least if we can recognize what's been going on, then we can know better and do better. So then we can start to break those cycles. It's more of that just realistic, raw, transparent conversation and discussion of, this is where we're at right now. This has happened. This is where we want to go forward, right? Just recognizing that we do have some power to stop and end the cycles of shame and guilt and trauma, and empower each person individually on possibly how to do so. I can bring some techniques and tips and tricks that are more than just, take a bubble bath or do XYZ, because again, one size doesn't fit all. So one approach might not work for me versus for you versus for someone else. So I'll bring a little bit more approach on other things that we could try.
I'm so excited for this. It's going to be incredible. And I think it will be so helpful. And I think I'm going to learn a lot. And I'm really excited about that. Ilimari, if people want to find you and work with you, where can they find you online or other places?
Well, full disclosure, I have a social media through Instagram, but I have not been keeping it up. My Instagram is With an Open Heart LLC. I do still have my information up there. It's just not very active right now. But my website, withanopenheartllc.com, I've been transitioning more into that BIPOC, Latin trauma space. It has information on my background, my passions, some resources as well on my website. So going on the website, they can reach out either via contact me form or email or phone number. Psychology Today, Latin therapist directory, inclusive therapist directory. I'm trying to make sure my information is in a lot of the BIPOC spaces as well.
Thank you so much for the incredible work that you're doing in this space. I know that you are helping so many people confront some of the generational trauma and cycles that they've experienced, and then helping them work through it. And we're so excited to bring your expertise to the retreat. Can't wait to see you. And for everyone listening, I will be sure to link all of the resources Ilimari mentioned, including the books and her website and all of that good stuff. Thank you again so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.